Welcome to this presentation on exploring the elements of CADRE's National Dispute Resolution Longitudinal Database. Where do data come from? I'm Melanie Reese, the director of CADRE, and I'm going to walk you through how we get the information you'll see presented in CADRE's National and State Dispute Resolution Data Dashboard. In this video, I'll briefly cover the elements of CADRE's Continuum of Dispute Resolution Processes and Practices. I'll then share how states report their data, both the national dispute resolution data and the state child count data. Next, I'll cover how CADRE compiles these data into our National Longitudinal Dispute Resolution Database. And finally, I'll briefly discuss how all of this comes together in the Dispute Resolution Data Dashboard, highlighting how comparisons can be made and the limitations we should keep in mind when looking at the data. Let's get started with an overview of the dispute resolution options covered in the data. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, requires state agencies to oversee and manage 3 dispute resolution options in the event that there are disagreements over special education or early intervention matters provided for under the law. The 3 options for dispute resolution are mediation, state complaints, and due process complaints. Most states have additional processes available that are not required under the IDEA, such as facilitation. CADRE's Continuum of Dispute Resolution Processes and Practices provides a visual model to explain the various dispute resolution options that may be available for districts and families. The top line shows the different levels of intervention, with the first 3 focusing on practices that serve to prevent conflict or address it early before it escalates. These early dispute resolution options, such as case managers, local level mediation, and facilitation, are not included in the data that states report to the federal government, and subsequently, they are not included in the data dashboard. But you can find more information about early dispute resolution processes and practices on our website. As we move further to the right on the levels of intervention, we find the procedural safeguards. These dispute resolution processes and practices are required under the IDEA, and states are required to report on their use annually to the U.S. Department of Education. These data elements are included in CADRE's Dispute Resolution Data Dashboard. Section 618 of the IDEA requires that each state submit data about the children who receive special education and related services under the IDEA. States submit their data for the previous school year in November. The Office of Special Education Programs goes through their verification and monitoring process and then releases the dispute resolution data to CADRE the following year. The most current data on the dashboard will be for the previous school year. States report in 4 dispute resolution areas: written signed complaints, mediation, due process complaints, and expedited due process complaints. Each section has specific elements of the dispute resolution process reported on by the states. In Section A, states report on written signed complaints, also called state complaints. Specifically, they report on these 8 elements: the number of complaints filed, the number of reports issued, reports with findings of noncompliance, reports within timelines and with extended timelines, complaints pending a due process hearing, and complaints withdrawn or dismissed. In Section B, states report their mediation activity, including the total number of mediation requests received, mediations held related to due process complaints and those agreements, as well as mediations held not related to due process complaints and the number of those mediation agreements. They report mediations pending and the mediations withdrawn or not held. Section C reporting covers due process complaints. States report the total number of due process complaints filed, resolution meetings, written settlement agreements, hearings fully adjudicated, decisions within timelines and with extended timelines, due process complaints pending, and those withdrawn or dismissed, including those resolved without a hearing. Finally, Section D covers expedited due process complaints. States report the number of expedited due process hearings filed, resolution meetings, written settlement agreements, hearings fully adjudicated, any change of placements ordered, expedited due process complaints pending, and expedited due process complaints withdrawn or dismissed. When CADRE receives the data from the Department of Education, we review it for mathematically impossible and highly improbable values based on definitions in the federal instructions or what would fall outside of what we would normally expect based on past performance in those states. For example, if a state had a history of 50 due process hearings filed each year over the past 5 years, but last year reported only 3, this would cause us to question that reporting. Or, if their child count dropped by 70% in one year, we would follow up with that state to ensure that it was a correct figure that was reported. When such values are identified, CADRE contacts states individually, and if states have more accurate information to provide, CADRE will accept those revisions. The quality of data has improved significantly in recent years. In addition to dispute resolution data, CADRE incorporates the child count data for each state and territory. Child count is the number of children with disabilities receiving special education and related services according to an individualized education program or service plan in place on the count date, typically December 1st, as reported by the state or entity. CADRE combines the 618 dispute resolution data with the state's December 1st child count and incorporates it in our longitudinal database, which holds the dispute resolution and child count data reported since 2004-2005 up to the most current year. Now, we would expect a state with several 100,000 students with disabilities to have more dispute resolution activity than a state with less than 30,000 students. If we looked at just the total number of dispute resolution events, it would be difficult to meaningfully compare states like California, Texas, and New York to relatively small states like Utah, Tennessee, Idaho, and Wyoming. And this is why we bring in the child count data. We can use a per capita comparison based on the state's child count to compare between states of different populations. We can compare states by asking, for every 10,000 students in special education, how many of a particular type of dispute resolution event, such as mediations held, were there? The formula that we use is the number of dispute resolution events, like mediations held, divided by the child count for that state, and then we multiply that number by 10,000. For example, if we had 150 mediations held in one state that had a child count of 75,000, we would take 150 and divide it by 75,000. We would then take that number, 0.002, and multiply it by 10,000 to find the rate of 20 mediations held per 10,000 child count for that state. Here's how it helps. We can compare states with various sizes to each other. Tennessee has a child count of 127,179 and had 94 state complaints filed in 2021-22. Wyoming is a much smaller state with 15,924 child count and had 14 state complaints filed. Texas is a much larger state with more than 635,000 child count. They had 542 state complaints filed that same year. But if we compare by a 10,000 child count, we can see that Tennessee had 7.4 state complaints compared to Wyoming's 8.8 and 8.5 in Texas per 10,000 child count. The child count comparison is less helpful when you have very small entities with a child count of less than 10,000. This makes the activity appear to be more frequent than it really is. Take Guam, with a child count of 1,754 and one state complaint filed. If we look at their per 10,000 child count rate, it's 5.7, which isn't a clear representation of their very low dispute resolution activity. As with any data set, it's important to consider the limitations. First, the quality of the data, particularly pre-2007, may be less accurate than in later years. Over the years, more data checks have been put in place, and the consistency in the data reporting has improved. There have been definitional refinements as well. For example, OSEP significantly clarified in their instructions what counted as a resolution agreement in 2018, and we noted the impact the following year and more consistency in the data since that time. Next, some data elements hide as much as they reveal. For example, The data does not include actions initiated in a previous reporting year that continued into the new reporting year. This means that activity that was pending in the previous year is left unaccounted for in the data. Additionally, the category of due process complaints withdrawn, dismissed, or otherwise resolved without a hearing is a big bucket that provides little information about what led to that classification. Third, reporting using a mean or average can skew results when there are large outliers, which there are. When one state that accounts for 65% of all due process complaints filed, for example, that state can skew the results and show national trends where they don't really exist except for in that one state. Fourth, data can be affected by unexpected factors. For example, data anomalies, like we experienced in 2020, 2021 with the COVID-19 pandemic, are averaged into the mix without any additional information. Finally, it's important to remember that numbers do not tell a complete story. Statistics offer important markers of information, but do not take into consideration the uniqueness of states, critical incidences that may impact those numbers, or any other variables, including historical, cultural, and environmental conditions that are relevant for gaining a true understanding of how to accurately interpret data. Keeping the limitations of data in mind is important for accurate and fair interpretation. This concludes the information about where do data come from on CADRE's National and State Dispute Resolution Data Dashboard. You can contact us at www.cadreworks.org for additional information. Thank you.